Well, good afternoon. I'm really excited for the opportunity to discuss a topic that might seem a little unusual, but at the end of the day, this is a very important principle to realize. And I am gearing this specifically at advisors, but if you're a business owner, especially one who is looking to exit, or even one that's, getting things started or scaling, this is relevant to a very broad audience. In fact, I would go so far as to say any business owner or anybody who works with business owners, a lot of what we will be discussing today is very relevant to you. But if you specifically are an advisor who works with business owners who are 5 to 7 years out, this is something that you should at least be beginning the discussion with them today. And if they are 3 to 5 years from exiting, this is a discussion that really should focus less on, okay, understanding what we're discussing and more on the importance of them really getting things going. Just for the simple reality that it's going to take at least 2 years, likely, to get a business ready for a sale. And then, you throw in the sale process, it'll be another one, and it could be more. But the importance of what we're going to be discussing today is really emphasized in the fact that when you're dealing with issues in a business, they're not isolated. And that's where the title of this webinar, The Interconnected Business, comes from. Now, most people, when it looks like they are dealing with problems, is they will look at the problem and they will treat it as if it is just an isolated occurrence. The reality is, because of the way businesses are, you're not likely dealing with just one problem. If you're dealing with an issue, there are likely multiple other issues that are involved. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a look at how this manifests itself. So here is a bit of the agenda that we're going to be working on today. We're going to be looking at the interconnectedness principle to start off. Then we're going to be delving into the single-problem fallacy, which is an area that, a lot of people will assume is the case. Then what we're going to do is we're kind of take a look at where problems hide. And it's really in 6 areas, many of which, I deal with directly, specifically with my practice. Then we're going to take a look at the exit readiness stakes that, all of these issues have an impact on. And then what we're going to do is we're going to focus specifically for advisors. And by the way, even though, some of the slides are going to say financial advisors, the fact is CPAs and really anybody who has any advisory role for business owners, I want you to take your title and replace that, just because of the fact that if you are an advisor who works with business owners, you have a very, very specific function in this system. Then we're going to finish up with a practical conversation and, really opening up questions that really can change a relationship. So let's start off with this interconnectedness principle and really kind of get a good grasp on what it is. Due to the deeply interconnected nature of business, a problem that is truly isolated is highly unlikely. When something is off, other things are already off. They may just not have surfaced yet. And that surfacing part is crucial, just because of the fact that, if something is wrong over here, even though other issues may not have come to the surface yet, there is a lag. And sometimes it might be, a few months, sometimes it might be a couple years. But, the reality is, if we address an issue over here, what we'll begin to realize is there are other issues that are connected that, they may not have matured and blossomed into a full problem, but they're on the way and, they need to be addressed as well. So that's the interconnectedness principle. And what I'm going to have as really the best question I want to pose that will really help emphasize this point is, when you find a problem in a client's business, how often is it actually isolated? That is a question every advisor needs to have asked and spend significant time thinking about. When you find a problem in a client's business, how often is it actually isolated? This is something that really, really, really we need to come to full terms with. And the reality is, the problem, it's not an isolated incident. Every department, every function and process is linked. I mean, really, a business is a closed system. So if there's a problem here, it's going to have an impact elsewhere. That's why, you know, one of the big reasons why we replace rotted wood is because if it's touching other wood, that rot is going to spread everywhere. So the reality is, since businesses are interconnected, if you have a problem, you have to deal with it. If you're not going to deal with it, it's going to spread and it's going to cause other problems. And that brings us to the second point: is problems rarely stay where they start. I mean, they spread like wildfire, like cancer, like rot, like termites. And you know, you could have a rather devastating impact. I think yesterday I was I happened to go out and look in my backyard, and I noticed something that looked a little unusual in my neighbor's yard. What I discovered was apparently a tree that had been dead for a while. I don't know if it was a combination of termites or rot, but that tree had completely collapsed. Thankfully, it collapsed into the middle of their yard where, you know, it's just a field, there's nothing. It didn't damage anything, but that is the way problems happen. Is, you know, they're not going to just stay put. They will grow until finally, you know, they cause a big problem like that tree collapsing. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, the presenting problem is almost never the root cause. And this is just something that is really important to grasp. Now, if we know where to look, there's a good chance that we will be able to identify the problem. But the reality is, you know, the presenting problem, you know, the fact that it is a problem that has our attention now, it, you know, there's a very good chance that it was actually caused somewhere else, and that, you know, what we're seeing is actually the symptom and it's not the actual problem. So, and you know, as that slide also says, is like the action happened upstream. So, you know, the reality is, when we see a problem, always look upstream. I mean, this is not really rocket science. The reality is, okay, the problem is here, but you know, look further, look around and look upstream of it. You will likely find out where that problem actually materialized. So here is the lag effect that we really need to understand when it comes to this principle. And you know, really, it falls into these four steps. First of all is the action, and it could be a decision, a hire, a departure, a structural change. You name it, it could be anything. And that is the action that really causes everything. Now, the ripple is adjacent functions that absorb and redistribute the impact. This is kind of where problems begin to grow, and you know, really are going to be multiplying just because of the fact of that ripple effect. Of again, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Well, we do something in that action, the ripple is going to cause reactions. Now, once we get to step three after the ripples, that's the lag, where you know, weeks, months, or years pass and seemingly nothing is changing. The reality is, underneath, there are problems. And then finally, when we get to the symptom, is a problem surfaces, and there's a very good chance it could be very far removed from where the original action is. And then the reality is, okay, we'll start seeing multiple symptoms that will start manifesting themselves. And there's a good chance, good possibility that a lot of it is interconnected. Now, this last statement at the bottom of the slide really needs to be emphasized. The lag effect is why business owners present with the wrong problem, and why advisors who only address the symptom leave the root cause untouched. In other words, you know, if we have an issue, that it's important that we really, really delve into it deeply, because there's a good chance that, okay, there's a lot of other things happening underneath, and we shouldn't just look at this problem as if it's isolated. We should think, okay, let's just take a moment, stop, really get into the nitty gritty. Okay, now the single problem fallacy is something that we really, really need to kind of take in here for a moment. And that is, most business owners present with one problem because the isolated problem feels solvable. In other words, we feel like, okay, this is an issue, we can easily address it. But the reality is, most advisors are going to treat that problem in isolation because that's kind of what their lane allows. And the reality is both are operating on an incomplete picture of the system, is just because of the fact that we think, okay, we have this problem, well, let's just address it. Well, the problem is, that problem, it's not isolated. As we've seen, everything is interconnected. That problem is just not going to be solved by itself, especially if there are other issues that connect back to it. So here are some examples of how interconnected things are. The owner says we have a cash flow problem. Well, the reality is we could have revenue concentration, pricing inconsistency, accounts receivable delays, and no budget controls. It could be a conglomeration of those things. And by the way, when I'm using these as an example, I'm not saying, okay, it is always this. It could be a combination of all these things. They could be in a different order. The scope of the problem could be it, but the reality is it's likely multiple things converging that cause that cash flow problem. Okay, when the owner says we need to hire someone, well, it could be a combination of their founder dependency, the owner is doing a lot of work, plus undocumented processes, and there's no succession path, and there's an exit risk. So the reality is there's that convergence of all these things that are causing the owner to say we need to hire somebody. Another thing, the owner says sales are down this quarter. Well, what's really happening is there could be a broken handoff from marketing. There could be confusion over pricing, and then, delivery quality erosion. In other words, there's a series of problems that are causing sales to be down. And then a final example, we have a key employee issue. Well, for starters, you can have some culture issues with your company where there's, you might have a bad actor who is, somebody who is clearly doing things in the workplace they shouldn't. You have compensation misalignment where, you may not be paying your best people or your key person what their market value is. Leadership opacity. In other words, you have decision making that is just not clear, and the leadership is they're not really existing in order to help out and really participate in the way that leadership should. And then, of course, retention risk, where, okay, the key person's looking to exit. So just because they're frustrated with things. So as you can see, these are some things that manifest themselves as a single problem. But the reality is there are multiple things that are contributing to this, multiple things that actually need to be addressed before we can actually fix that problem. The reality is what'll happen is when you start addressing all these issues, well, what looks like the symptom, what looks like the actual problem actually gets resolved. But it's just because it's a series of other things that are converging and coalescing. So here's the section that, where we're really drilling down, and that's where problems hide in a business. We're going to look at 6 operational areas that consistently absorb and redistribute dysfunction. And, it's often invisible. But what'll happen is while it's often invisible, when it comes time for due diligence, this is kind of when things like this surface. So here are 6 areas, which is, if you've followed much of the content, you'll notice that, okay, marketing and technology, those are actually 2 areas that when it comes to the 7 pillars that we work with are combined. But for our purposes of this presentation, we're combining them. So these are areas and that, absorb and distribute dysfunction. Um, and really, in each case, what happens is it's a matter of, you know, we're just not, simply not handling things appropriately. Like, for example, under data and analytics, we're not making decisions on data, but basically on our gut and not and on our evidence. And we don't have a baseline established. There's no visibility. In other words, we're just you know not using data. We're just going on instinct. With budget controls, we're just not using the budgeting process or control processes. We're not tracking things. We're not really studying our spending patterns. In other words, everybody is let to do whatever they want. Strategic planning, it's reactive. We're not planning, we're not thinking ahead. We don't have a long-term goal. With processes and procedures, we don't have anything documented. The knowledge is all tribal. Operations, we have bottlenecks that, and the owner is, the critical path. In other words, the owner is involved with the decision making, and the business simply cannot run without the founder. And then, when it comes to marketing and technology, we have lead gen that's tied to the relationships, and there's no system. And, the pipeline, it's just not going to survive the transition. And with tech, obviously, it's like, okay, the tech is just not serving what the company needs. So these are areas that, you can really see very quickly how the dysfunction is being distributed. And as you can also see on the flip side, you can see how if we were to focus on fixing these areas and making sure they are the way they are, the dysfunction will get cleared up quickly. And that's really the key of why there are 7 pillars to the work that we do when it comes to the exit planning process, is just because of the fact that since all these areas are interconnected, getting them all fixed and cleaned up is going to help make sure that the business is on track. Now, here is an example of how a single problem can become a system failure. Now, I'm just using this as an example. We could replace it with pretty much any other example that we've seen. But let's say, for example, we have one bad hire. We hire somebody who, we really didn't necessarily do our due diligence as, in leadership. We didn't, we didn't go with, we were thinking, okay, well, there might be some misalignment with values. It could be a wide range of things, but the whole point is there was one bad hire. Well, what happens? Well, then we have the cultural reaction. They just don't play well with everybody, or, they begin to bring out the worst elements in others. And that's how the culture begins to become toxic. And then we have retention reaction, where, all of a sudden we start having people wanting to leave just because of the fact that, the culture is shifted. And then finally, we have the client delivery reaction, where the clients are thinking, okay, your service is just not as good as it has been. And, we may start losing clients. So here's the thing. By the time the client delivery problem is surfaced, look at just how far removed from the actual delivery process we are. We actually are several steps. And, this is, again, why things get misattributed, is because there is such a distance between things. And, at the end of the day, there were warning signs there. But, this is why it comes back to the fact that, why it's so important we get that hire correct. And even though I don't specifically, I don't view myself as an HR professional, this is why I am very, very, when it comes to hiring people, and, we will do this work as needed, is it's very important that, we make sure we have a values match and everything aligns. So that way, we make sure that we don't have something like this manifest itself. So this chain is something that, obviously we can see how it plays out. And again, it's an example of how one problem can become a system failure, especially when you don't do anything about it. You let the culture react, and then you let people start leaving, and then finally client delivery problems. So if you don't address problems like this when they begin to come, and really the way that you would do it is if it's clear that, okay, it's a bad hire, well, you got to own it. You're the one who hired them, and you got to either figure out, is there a way we can course correct and get them to improve, or do we need to remove them and get somebody else? But either way, the way we fix things is we make sure that we start solving problems, and we don't disregard them, just brush them off. Okay, so here we get to where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and this is the exit readiness stakes. The reality is buyers don't buy financials, they buy systems. This is where a lot of business owners misunderstand what buyers are looking for. You see, a business isn't bought and sold based on great financials. It's built on transferability. In other words, the transferable nature of the business is the primary driver, not the revenue. So if a buyer is looking and they see a business with unresolved and interconnected problems that it's clear they're not going to survive due diligence, that's a problem for everyone, including the business owner, just because of the fact that you're either going to have a significant reduction, if you're lucky, when it comes to the sale of price, or they're just going to walk away because they're going to think, the financials may look great, but if I don't think this business is going to survive the transfer, I don't want to waste money. So that's where the exit readiness stakes come in. Okay, so here's a look at what buyers want and what kills deals in due diligence. A buyer wants predictable recurring revenue, but what's going to kill that deal is if the founder is, the business, the business is founder dependent, and, if they leave, that kills the revenue, as well as the deal. Buyers want documented systems that run without the owner. This is why we have the 90-day test. Can your business run without you for 90 days? Well, if you don't have any documented process and the knowledge just walks out at the door at 5 o'clock every day, people don't want to buy that, just because of the fact that, if something happens between 5:01 and say 7:59, so that way that knowledge disappears with that person, that's a risk that nobody wants to spend. Now, buyers want a diverse customer base with no concentration risk. What is going to kill a deal is revenue concentration. I have down here an example. Your top 3 clients take up a share of 60% of the revenue. I've heard of one client taking up 80%. Now, one side note, GovCon is its own animal. I know that, GovCon businesses typically have just one client, the federal government. I'm not going to touch them here with this discussion, and really just because of my network, GovCon businesses really aren't going to work well in this, just because of that. But again, they're specialized and they have their own animal. But the reality is, with revenue concentration, is, for me, the target is 20% of or less is one client. 30, when you start having concentration in one client hit 30% or more, that's when people start walking. But my goal is 20% or less concentration in one client. And really, the more distributed and more diverse we can make the base, the better. Okay, clean financials with explainable variances. In other words, you have everything very detailed and thorough. You understand why, okay, you may have spent more in one area than another, or, why the numbers were different this quarter. That's what buyers want, because it shows that you have a very clear grasp on what's going on. Unexplained financial variances, that's going to be a discount in the buyer's mind. Now, on the flip side, buyers want a management team that can execute post-close. On the flip side, what's going to kill the deal is if there's no management team and the buyer needs to build from scratch, or, and this is kind of where this one hides, is if you already have the management team, you have the succession plan, you essentially have a CEO, CFO, COO, you have everyone having titles, but you are still making the decisions. In other words, even though on paper you have a management team, if you as the owner are still the one holding veto power over decisions, buyers aren't going to like that. And the reason why is because, hey, the management team isn't their management in name only. So then the final area is buyers don't want operational liabilities. Again, they want something that's going to transfer. If the operations are opaque and, they really can't understand how things work just because they're not documented or, one way or the other, a buyer's not going to buy that. Okay, so now we come to the part for advisors, and this is your role in this system. Every advisor is going to see the part of the system. And really, what's most important for every advisor here is the most valuable advisors are going to be the ones who understand where their view ends and then connect their clients to the resources that address what they can't see. This is why a lithograph that the Exit Planning Institute has in their materials is so helpful. It's a picture of this round table, and seated at it are different professionals who are necessary in the exit planning process. Because of the nature of every deal being different, you may have some cases you may have a smaller table, other cases you may have a larger table. But the reality is that you need to have multiple advisors who are in the room, who are talking, who know what their lane is, and who are able to, make sure that they bring in the right people at the right time. So here is roughly the area, what it looks like from our perspective. And again, these are kind of like the generals here. The generals will enlist others. Like, for example, the financial advisors that you see and what is listed as far as what they do, they may have a real estate attorney who is coming in to talk with them and maybe handle the estate, or like if there's buildings. They'll also, obviously, that's why I meant the real estate, as well as may have an estate attorney. So there will be multiple people there, possibly maybe even a CPA to help with the taxes. So even though the financial advisor is listed, there are a lot of advisors there. The fractional COO, or this is basically the and using CPA terminology, the value accelerator. There are going to be people they may need to bring in. It could be somebody who works with benefits. If the financial advisor, they don't feel comfortable, developing a buy sell, especially if it's somebody who is actually going to be like a partner leaving a firm. There's going to be a need for that. It may need to be somebody who deals with, works directly with benefits, especially if, for example, the advisor. So in other words, the fractional COO or the value accelerator, they may actually need to bring things in, especially if the financial advisor just doesn't deal with that. And that's kind of what makes this role a little tricky, is just because of the fact that, obviously the advisor has a big lane and there are a lot of people they can bring in. The fractional COO needs to be willing to look for areas and address areas that, either of these are not able to pick up the slack in. And especially another area is, the books. If the books need to be cleaned up, okay, you're probably going to need to enlist a fractional controller who can get them cleaned up, especially if there's a lot of work. The M&A advisor, this is where, we're going to be not only the sell side, but, they're going to have M&A attorneys who are involved, possibly like CPAs who are looking at the deal from a tax perspective. In other words, there are going to be a lot of things that they're going to be looking at as well. And the reality is all three of these people are going to need to be talking and, okay, do we need to look at this? Well, and then whoever's area it is, they will basically be the one handling it. But the reality is, and again, as I mentioned with financial advisor, this could also be a CPA instead of, just a wealth management, just because of the fact that, you're actually doing the taxes and, you're fitting into that role. So the reality is, while the titles may look a little different, the reality is you have a wealth architect, you have an operations architect, and then you have a deal architect. And those are the three key general roles, so to speak, in this process. Now, let's get down to the practical conversation. And it's one question is going to shift the entire conversation from referral request to strategic collaboration. And this is what we want to do right now, is really take this interconnected principle we've talked about and then use it to open a deeper dialogue with every client that you work with. So here's the question. When you find a problem in a client's business, how often is it actually isolated? And here are, several key things for us to keep in mind. Every advisor already knows the answer. You're not teaching, you're confirming. So, that's why that is one reason why this is very helpful. It also makes the referral logic self-evident because at the end of the day, hey, if you're addressing this question properly, you're going to know, okay, I have this specific lane. Let me contact so-and-so who works in the lane that actually addresses this issue. This also is going to help share intellectual ground because we come to agree on this principle before any ask. In other words, we realize that, okay, yes, even though I may understand a bit about, accounting and tax law, I am not a CPA. I will understand I need to get a CPA in who will help us address the issues that, again, on the interconnectedness principle. And, this also works across every advisory type. In other words, the interconnected process principle is the reason why it's so important to get all the advisors in the same room. Because between all the advisors, we have all of the same answers. Okay, now here are just some examples about deepening the dialogue, especially once we've come to terms with, the reality of this issue. So how often do we ask it? So again, feel free to take a look at these questions and ask them. When your business owner clients come to you with a financial problem, do you ever suspect the real issue is somewhere else in the business? Have you ever seen a client's deal fall apart in due diligence over something that seemed unrelated? If a client came to you today saying that they want to exit in 3 years, do you have somebody you'd send to them to get the business operationally ready? Again, this is because businesses, about 80 to 90% of businesses that go to market are just not ready. And then finally, how do you typically handle it when you can see the financial problem clearly, but the operational root cause is out of your lane? Really, here is where the dialogue needs to be with these questions. These questions are designed to help us to start thinking about how we address these issues. If you're a CPA, if you're not addressing these issues, they're going to find somebody else who's going to they feel like is a better CPA for them. If you're a financial advisor who, you're hearing these issues and you're not doing anything about it, or you're not pointing them in the right direction, they're going to find a financial advisor who will. So the reality is these are questions that, we all need to look at and grasp just because of the fact if we don't take them seriously and think through them, we're going to lose them to somebody who is going to do that. So here are some takeaways that we really need to have from this material. First off, business problems are interconnected by nature. They're not isolated. if something surfaces, there's a very good chance, as we saw in a lot of these examples, that there are multiple other areas that are contributing to that problem. Now, the presenting problem is rarely the root cause. Again, we saw that, and it's because of lag time. So when serious issues begin to surface, the reality is they've been there for a while, and they've just been growing and festering and coalescing into this problem. Here is where I would encourage anybody who is listening to this to really take this to heart. Advisors who understand the system add value. You may not be the one who is able to get into this work. I don't do valuations, but I do know people who do. As I said, I'm not a CPA, but I do know people who are. I am not a financial advisor who has a system for getting people ready for exiting. I know people who do. In other words, I know people who can address what I don't. And that is where you can add value, by building out your book and knowing people. And by the way, one thing I will say, I am not a believer in this, having 3 people that you could make recommendations. That's very lazy. What I do advocate is like, actually having advisors that and you work with. Yeah, there will be some people who will not be a good fit. And yeah, that's why you need to have multiple people, because there might be some times where, this is just not a good fit culturally. But the beauty is if you all want the same thing, that's a good thing. That's a very uncommon problem. I mean, it does happen. It's something we need to be aware about. But the reality is, if you know advisors who add value and are dedicated to serving their client, that is where you can excel. And that's why it's like, no, work with advisors who can do that. And here's the thing, the 3 to 5 year window is the opportunity. Interconnected problems that get addressed before this window, they're going to really significantly add value. Now, obviously, we live in an imperfect world. There's a good chance that there are going to be issues that, we're going to need to address during that window that, they are interconnected. I mean, that's the reason why we say it takes several years to get a business ready. It's because of this interconnectedness principle with business. So here is what I'm going to leave you with. Let's continue this conversation. I have many advisors throughout the country, both M&A as well as financial advisors and CPAs that I have conversations with. I actually, this slide, I realize right now it's a little out of date. I actually will work with clients up to 100 million in revenue. So really that range is 2 to 100 million. But, if you have business owner clients that are in this range who are looking to exit in the next 3 to 5 years, let's talk. For my network of, in addition, like with investment bankers, I believe we can find a solution that will help us to find ways to get the business ready. And again, it's because things are interconnected. And it's because they're interconnected. That's why it's a team sport. So obviously we'll continue the conversation, but here's what I would encourage you. If you're an advisor and you realize you have clients in this, here are some next steps for you. For starters, schedule a discovery call. And this obviously, obviously after we've talked, what we could do is basically I'd be willing to be a part of that. We could have a one of my M&A partners come in, and we could just sit down and just talk, and we would be able to rather quickly identify where readiness gaps exist. That's one thing. Another thing, start identifying clients. I mean, if you start seeing clients who are fitting any of the things that we've discussed, start identifying them and, start having conversations with them saying, hey, are you looking to exit soon? Just, I mean, 3 to 5 years might sound like it's a disc time off, but considering the work that needs to be done, if you want to exit in that time, we need to do that. Or if you're seeing some of the issues that we talked about, maybe say, hey, how is business going? Do you feel like you could use some help? Just because, hey, I work with advisors who can help you out. you know, Obviously, this last part, make a warm introduction. I would love, well, obviously, the simple email would be great. I would love to be involved in a call with you on that, just because they're your client. You work with them. I don't want to take them areas that you don't feel comfortable with. Um, but here is the big thing that I would love is if none of those, if you're not positioned for any one or multiple of those, let's build a relationship. A lot of the people that I work with, we work on a cadence. And, some people it's quarterly, some people it's monthly, some people it's 6 weeks. The cadences vary. But what I would love is if this resonates with you, I would love for us to sit down and work together because, again, this is an interconnected business principle, shows that these issues are interconnected, which means that if we have a team that we're able to work together, we will be able to solve it. So I wanted to thank you all again for attending this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If you would love to connect, I would love to just begin the conversation now with you about, how we would work towards addressing these issues that are truly interconnected. Well, thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.